Jacob finally worked up the courage to do something he immediately regretted. He slowly pulled down the zipper of his tent, just a few inches, only enough to peek outside through a narrow gap that was instantly flooded with icy wind and snowflakes. He raised his flashlight, its beam cutting weakly through the swirling white chaos. That's when he saw them. Footprints. Not the messy boot prints they had made earlier while packing up. These were new, fresh, laid down after the storm had already begun. They circled the campsite in a perfect, methodical ring. The footprints were too clean, too evenly spaced, and although the falling snow distorted them slightly, their shape was unmistakable. They were footprints that looked far too human to belong to any animal, but far too cold, precise, and organized to belong to any of them. They didn't lead in from one direction and out another. They just went around, again and again, like a ritual, a silent patrol, not meant to attack, but to claim, to intimidate, to test the limits of the human mind. Jacob zipped the tent shut immediately, his breathing shallow and rapid. Every instinct screamed at him to wake the others, to shout, to do something, but he stopped himself. Panic, he knew, was exactly what whatever was outside wanted. Instead, he tried to count the footprints, tried to find a flaw, a mistake, something, anything, that would make this make sense. But all he found was terrifying perfection, a pattern executed by something impossibly patient. Jacob forced his eyes to stay open, fighting exhaustion that threatened to pull him into a dangerous sleep. And that's when he saw it, a figure standing among the dense pine trees. At first, it almost blended into the storm, just another dark shape swallowed by snow. But its posture was wrong, too rigid, too deliberate. It didn't sway like the trees. It didn't flicker like a shadow. It stood there, completely still, facing his tent. And what made Jacob's heart feel like it stopped entirely was the shape of it, the height, the proportions, even the slight tilt of its head. It was him, a perfect reflection, carved from ice and darkness, a frozen double without warmth, without life, just a hollow imitation wearing his shape. The thing didn't wave, it didn't move closer, it didn't need to. Its existence was the threat, a visual violation that shattered Jacob's sense of identity and reality.
For a brief moment, he wondered if this was a hallucination, sleep deprivation mixed with extreme fear. But deep down, he knew, with chilling certainty, it was real. The forest had made a copy of him, a doppelganger, standing there like a boundary marker between sanity and something far worse. And even though he couldn't see its eyes through the snow and shadows, Jacob felt its gaze, a gaze that suggested complete understanding of every fear, every doubt, every weakness buried inside him. Across the campsite, Sarah was experiencing a different kind of terror, an auditory one. She heard her name being called. At first, it was a soft whisper, so close it sounded like someone was kneeling beside her tent, speaking gently through the nylon wall. The voice was familiar, comforting. It sounded like her mother, the same tone she used when Sarah was a child. That's what made it horrifying. Her mother was thousands of miles away. That voice did not belong in the middle of an Alaskan blizzard. As she turned her head, trying to pinpoint the source of the whisper, she heard her name again, this time from the opposite direction, deep in the forest. Loud, urgent, panicked. It sounded like Daniel, like he was in serious trouble. The two calls overlapped almost perfectly, one soft and reassuring, the other desperate and afraid, creating a sharp dissonance inside her mind, an acoustic trap designed to fracture her attention, to force a choice. Which voice do you trust? Which direction do you unzip the tent toward? Safety or danger? She clamped her hands over her ears, trying to block out the competing voices, but the whispers didn't fade. They vibrated inside her skull, as if the entity outside didn't need air to speak, only nerves. Sarah felt her logical thoughts unravel under the impossible duality of the galls. A sickening doubt crept in. What if one of them was real? What if someone she loved actually needed help? Or worse, what if both voices were nothing more than bait, carefully engineered by something far smarter than any predator? A game designed to lure its prey out of its final shelter. And once that zipper opened, there would be no going back.
The collective fear finally reached its breaking point when they realized Daniel was gone. He had vanished into complete silence. For several minutes, no one noticed at first. The storm had softened slightly, the wind no longer screaming Alayhi Salam violently, and that brief calm was what made the absence so loud. Jacob was the first to understand what was wrong. Daniel should have been in his tent, trying to restart their small portable heater, something he had mentioned just moments earlier. But now he wasn't there, and no one had heard a zipper open, no footsteps crunching through the snow, nothing. It was Alayhi Salam if Daniel had been forcibly removed from reality itself, pulled through some invisible tear in time, a sudden, unexplained gap where a person should have been. The empty space he left behind felt wrong, like a void forming at the center of an already fragile campsite. Jacob and Sarah locked eyes through the thinning curtain of snow. They were both thinking the same thing. Had the storm taken him? Or had something beneath the storm taken him? Or, an even more disturbing thought flashed through Jacob's mind, was Daniel somehow the cause of all of this? The memory of Daniel's voice from the night before, strange and out of place, surfaced uninvited. But before either of them could move, before they could attempt a rescue plan that would almost certainly fail, Daniel came back. Just Alayhi suddenly, just Alayhi silently. He emerged from the shadows beside his tent, stumbling forward like someone waking from a deep traumatic sleep. And what stood before them was no longer the Daniel they knew. His face was a living nightmare. His skin was deathly pale, almost translucent. His eyes were wide and unnaturally dark, Alayhi Salam if the pupils had swallowed the irises entirely. Frost clung to his hair and eyebrows, Alayhi Salam if he had been submerged in icy water. He didn't speak. He just stared at Jacob and Sarah with an expression that went beyond fear. There was a profound emptiness in his gaze, something that suggested he had seen the core of something never meant for human eyes. He looked older, exhausted, hollow. Alayhi Salam if those missing minutes had stretched into a century of psychological torment. Jacob grabbed him by the shoulders, shaking him, demanding answers. Daniel blinked slowly.
It was like he was dragging himself back into the world, pulling his mind from somewhere else entirely. When his voice finally came, it was barely more than a dry whisper, stripped of its resonance, almost lost beneath the muted howl of the wind. He spoke a single sentence, a sentence that shattered any remaining illusion of normalcy, a sentence that confirmed every unspoken fear they had been trying not to name. This forest doesn't want us to leave. The words hung between them. Simple, final, heavy with a weight that felt almost cosmic. In that moment, the blizzard stopped being a random act of nature. It became a tool, a deliberate mechanism, a chain binding them to the will of something unseen. Daniel's legs gave out. He collapsed into the snow, slumping against the side of his tent, staring blankly into the swirling storm. Whatever he had experienced out there had stripped him of reason, of resistance. What remained was only a fragile body carrying a terrifying certainty. They were prisoners, trapped in a place they had mistaken for an escape, and that mistake was going to cost them everything.
The wind intensified without warning, not gradually, violently. It surged to near hurricane force,
slamming into the campsite with enough power to threaten ripping the tent straight out of the frozen ground. This wasn't just moving air. It felt angry, cold, deliberate, and disturbingly personal, like a furious breath sweeping across the clearing, trying to erase the stain of human presence. Ice pellets lashed against the tents like shattered glass, striking the nylon with a terrifying force. And within this sonic chaos, this relentless roar, they realized something deeply unsettling. The strange sounds from the night before, the whispers, the footsteps, hadn't disappeared. They had merged with the storm. What they were hearing now wasn't just wind. It was a seamless orchestra of terror, where natural violence and something else had become indistinguishable. The boundary between weather and intent was gone. The small campfire they had fought desperately to keep alive was reduced to a faint bed of glowing embers. It had been their final symbol of resistance against the endless cold. Then it went out, not smothered by snow, not starved of fuel. It vanished as if something unseen had leaned down and exhaled. A massive, invisible breath that stole the fire's oxygen and its life in a single moment. Darkness swallowed the campsite. A heavier darkness. The only light left came from weak flashlights and the eerie bluish reflections of ice and snow, casting distorted shapes that seemed to shift just beyond the edge of vision. In that absolute darkness, beneath the deafening howl of the wind, Jacob, Sarah, and Daniel, who now sat completely silent and unresponsive, were forced to confront the most horrifying truth of all. What had followed them here was never the storm. The storm was just the surface. Beneath it was something far older, far more intelligent, and far more malevolent. Something that had lived here long before they arrived, hidden beneath the pristine snow, embedded in the silence they had come seeking. Their brief presence, so insignificant, so careless, had disturbed it. And now, it was awake. The storm wasn't trying to drive them away. It was trying to absorb them, to strip them of warmth, of sound, of identity, until they became just another part of its eternal stillness, another layer of silence, forever.
Jacob closed his eyes and let the psychological storm inside him rise to meet the physical storm raging outside the tent. He remembered why they had come here in the first place. They were searching for peace. They wanted silence. They wanted escape. And now, with a bitter sense of irony, Jacob realized they had found exactly what they were looking for. But this peace was not healing. It was emptiness, an emptiness that demanded sacrifice. The forest had its own brutal philosophy, one that did not need words to be understood. Any attempt to disturb its eternal silence would be answered the same way, not with violence, but with absorption, a permanent pulling inward, a quiet erasure. It was a lesson about human limits, taught by something far older than fear, far older than reason. Now fully aware that death was no longer a distant possibility, but an active presence stalking them, Jacob felt the boundary between reality and hallucination begin to collapse. Through the thin fabric of the tent, he saw a shape among the trees. It looked like him, standing upright, perfectly still. Was it real, or was it his own terror, given physical form by something outside human understanding? The question no longer mattered, because the result was the same. Jacob was already gone. His sense of self had fractured, splintered into pieces, and offered up to the vast nothingness surrounding them. And that slow mental dissolution, being unmade from the inside, was far more terrifying than the cold creeping through his bones. Inside the tent, Sarah reached for Daniel's hand. She knew, on some level, that the Daniel beside her was no longer fully there. What remained was a shell, warm, breathing, but hollowed out by trauma too deep to process. Still, she clung to the last warmth of his body. It was a desperate attempt to anchor herself, to keep from being swept away by the madness carried on the wind. Because the voice was still calling her name, over and over, threaded through the howling storm, intimate and precise, as if it knew her better than she knew herself. Sarah understood then that this terror was not about physical survival. It was about spiritual survival, about protecting the core of who they were from something that had no shape, no face, and no name, but possessed an insatiable need to fill its emptiness with frightened human souls. And then, outside the tent, the footsteps returned.
This time, they did not stop. They moved continuously, circling them, scraping snow and ice away from the ground alayhi salam they went. The sound suggested more than one presence, or worse, a single presence growing stronger, feeding on the storm itself. The footsteps quickened, almost playful, a cheerful dance of death in the frozen darkness. And then Jacob heard something else. Not just footsteps, a wet, dragging sound, like soaked fabric being pulled slowly across ice. Too close, too deliberate, too personal. It was the sound of something crossing the final boundary. The last illusion of safety had been broken. They were no longer alone. They were being watched.
Jacob remembered a legend he had once read, a story about Arctic spirits that did not seek blood, but memory. They were said to feed on warmth of a different kind, emotional warmth, human attachment, the heat of lived experience. These entities existed in eternal emptiness, and they believed memories were the only thing that could briefly fill that void. They were beings of furious silence. According to the legend, these spirits viewed humans alike sources of spiritual noise, chaotic, unstable signals that disrupted the purity of the frozen wilderness. And so they did not kill out of hunger or cruelty. They erased. They extinguished presence itself. Jacob understood then how perfectly exposed they were. They had come to this place carrying grief, exhaustion, unresolved emotions, cracks in their inner defenses. What they thought was vulnerability between friends was, in reality, an open invitation, an unintentional offering to the true inhabitants of Alaska's frozen nothingness. Suddenly, Daniel lifted his head. His eyes, empty just moments before, locked onto a single point beyond the tent wall. He didn't speak. Instead, he began murmuring numbers, calculations, measurements, technical fragments that made no sense in context. It was the final reflex of a collapsing mind, logic desperately rebuilding itself from scraps, a pitiful defense against something that could not be measured, modeled, or solved with equations. Jacob realized then that Daniel had stopped trying to survive. What he was doing now was something else entirely. He was trying to reassemble himself, using the last language he trusted. Like the storm reached its violent peak, the tent lurched hard to one side. Then Jacob felt it, a sudden, crushing pressure against the tent wall. Not wind, something solid, cold, heavy, like a massive hand pressing down from the outside. Jacob shut his eyes and let go. Inside the darkness, he heard Sarah scream, but it wasn't a scream of fear. It was grief, raw, shattering grief, the sound of someone realizing the fight was already over. Then, in a brief, unnatural lull in the storm, Jacob heard a whisper, the same voice he had heard the night before, but now it was clearer, closer, no longer outside. It spoke directly into the tent. You wanted peace. Now you will become peace. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. A cold, inevitable conclusion.
Jacob felt the cold pierce through his jacket and sleeping bag. But this wasn't the cold of air or snow. It was deeper, under the skin, inside the bones, reaching the core of his soul. It felt like theft, like his memories, his emotions, even the idea of who he was, being gently pulled from his body, absorbed, claimed. And he understood this exchange made perfect sense to the forest. They had come here seeking peace, and the wilderness had taken everything in return. When the storm finally gave way to a second dawn, no one could say what remained inside the tent. No one knew if they were still breathing, if they were still human, or if they were simply frozen figures left behind, silent monuments absorbed into the landscape. Jacob no longer heard the storm. He no longer felt the cold. There was only total silence, endless, absolute. The isolation he had once imagined, now fully realized. He had become part of the emptiness he sought, a permanent lesson carved into the frozen world, that escape is dangerous in places already claimed by forces older than time, and that in the end, silence is the most patient predator of all.
What they believed would be a quiet winter campsite, a place of silence and escape, became instead their silent grave. It stood alayhi salam, a monument to human arrogance, proof of what happens when people dare to disturb something ancient, something that had been resting long before they arrived. When the storm finally passed, it left behind a flawless sheet of untouched snow, clean, pristine, almost peaceful. The footprints that once circled the camp slowly vanished, swallowed by the endless white. Alayhi salam, if the terror that unfolded there had only been a brief illusion. All that remained were empty tents, abandoned and motionless, deep in the Alaskan wilderness, a place where silence does not merely exist, but rules. A place where quiet demands absolute obedience, and where the land itself keeps secrets it has no intention of sharing. Their car was still there, parked neatly near the cliff, undamaged, untouched. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no broken equipment, just a clean disappearance, an almost gentle evaporation of human presence, leaving behind nothing but piercing cold and perfect stillness. But this silence was different now, heavier, deeper, because hidden within it were 3 new souls, absorbed into the ancient choir of the wilderness itself, waiting with endless patience for the next visitors who dare to seek peace within the absolute dominion of a judgmental emptiness, in a place that has never truly been empty